G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video we're going through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Hungarian Grand Prix. So as always, if you're new around here, you're enjoying the content or you just want to see more F1 fantasy videos and a bloke talking into a microphone and a camera in his living room, do drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. First cab off the rank as always in these videos is my key deadline considerations for the race weekend. And one of the more fascinating topic of discussion to come out of the Belgian Grand Prix was the number of assets, and few of them, it seems like right now, that are likely to increase in value this coming weekend. We're heading to a track where it's a very, or typically lower overtake rate compared to most other circuits on the calendar. And as a result of that, makes it harder, especially for the backmarkers and midfield drivers, to rack up additional points to meet those thresholds for a price rise. And I think for me, it almost feels like for several assets in our team, or that would usually be in consideration, perhaps worth pivoting away from, not to actually increase value or for an alternative asset we might move into, but in fact preserve value by going for those drivers or constructors maybe that are not going to lose you any value. And I think kind of to give you a bit more color to the conversation, I'll bring us straight over to the Budget Builder on F1 Fantasy Tools. Use the code HUB50 for 50% off your first month of their premium features. You can see here that only 3 drivers, all of which are template assets in the B tier, need to score less than double-digit points for a max price rise. Now, I think all 3 of them, Hulkenberg, Stroll and Behrman, are perfectly fine holds for one more weekend at the very least. Even if Behrman doesn't get to 9 points, he still only needs to score 1 for a 0.2 rise. But beyond that, the waters do get a little bit murkier in terms of assets that could actually make sense for our fantasy teams. Alonso, I think, is probably a bit of a risk, as I talked about in my team selection video. And Alex Albon, I think he could definitely attain 3 points, but even 13 at the Hungarian Grand Prix would require a mammoth qualifying and Grand Prix result for him to get there. Beyond that, Sainz, Gasly, Ocon, who was a popular pick back in Silverstone and for some drivers and teams, I should say, in Belgium. But beyond that, there isn't really much in the way of value accretive B-tier drivers. Which is why it brings me to the point of, do we actually need to consider the likes of Liam Lawson, Franco Colapinto, or even Gabriel Bortoleto, who is only going to go down 0.2 million in value this week? Lawson, for me, I think is the standout of the 3. I talk about him and the reasons for that in my team selection video. But as soon as these DNFs that all 3 of these drivers have in Silverstone drop off their average, in Zandvoort after the summer break, I think are going to be very popular with the migration towards the 4A lineup. So I think for that reason, it's probably more, again, as I said before, preserving team value as opposed to chasing those rises. Albon's probably the only off-meta asset at the moment that stands out to me in the B tier. And in the A tier, for the drivers at least, Piastri just seems like a set and forget at the moment. I still think he's a great asset to own. But beyond that, Norris is realistically the only driver I'd really consider for the 2X beyond Oscar Piastri. Maybe Max Verstappen on a final fix, but there's nothing else that's really screaming to me in terms of the Ferrari drivers and George Russell that appeals as a budget building asset. So I think this is one of those weekends where we don't actually have to be as aggressive or can be aggressive with building budget. We're not going to see teams have 3.3 million in cost cap increases like we saw in Belgium. So I think it's more about preserving value to get to the A tier, the 4A tier lineup down the track. In terms of the good qualifiers, I'm hungry for them in Hungary. Already talked about that a little bit in my F1 article this week on Formula1.com, so check that out if you haven't done so already. Max Verstappen, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, Alex Albon, all great qualifiers, all drivers that should be at least within some thought of your mindset. And I think it's probably, again, easier to give you a visualization of why I think certain drivers are most appealing for Hungary because of how difficult it is to overtake. Oscar Piastri, the best qualifier, if we sort by qualifying position this year, at his price, a no-brainer. But I also like Max and Lando. All 3 of these drivers have had 4 pole positions this season, so I like just about all of them, but I think Piastri's price and form recently edges it for me. If we're looking further down the list, Alex Albon, for me, a standout driver. He's had 8 Q3s this season and has finished in the points 9 times out of the 10 races that he's crossed the checkered flag. So I think for me, a great option there. Alonso, not bad. 2 Q3s in his last 4 races, but it will take a mammoth effort for him to get even a minor price rise this weekend. So that seems to be one of the reasons why I'm not so incentivized to keep him for this week. Otherwise, there's probably nothing wrong with having bad qualifiers. You know, Hulkenberg, Stroll, Behrman, not great this year. They're just going to have to rely on DNFs from drivers ahead of them to get more points if they can't bag overtakes. So I think for me, it's pretty obvious who the top 3 candidates for the DRS boost are this week. Albon and even Liam Lawson a little bit further down the order. 2 Q3s in his last 3 races. That Racing Bulls is looking much better than it was earlier in the season. So I think there's quite a few people that should be on the radar this week based on their recent qualifying form. But that's pretty much the fact of the matter. At Hungary, overtakes are not going to be quite as frequent as many other tracks. So you want those guys that will qualify in the top half of the grid and be in a position to score points on the Sunday. Now, speaking of this track and what that means for things beyond the realms of a normal F1 fantasy weekend, this is probably one of the last weekends on the calendar, in my opinion, this year to use the Limitless chip. We saw some people deploy it to great effect and perhaps some unexpected surprise there in Belgium. And I look at Hungary similar to Monaco, where there are not that many overtakes, surely a few more, but not really that many more. The track averages about 3 overtakes per driver per year over the last 3, so about 60 overtakes per race. We may have more if it's wet weather, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but I think for me, if we look at Monaco and the success of the Limitless chip there, Hungary stands out to me as another reason for why it could be appealing. If you entered the McLaren Mini League, and I talked about this in a tweet last week, the best way to approach that, in my opinion, was to use the no negative in Silverstone with the wet weather, then the 3X in Belgium, and now the Limitless in Budapest. Now, I didn't use those chips because my team, I've already used no negative and Limitless earlier in the season. But if you followed a similar strategy, let me know where you are in that mini league rank, because Silverstone no negative worked a treat. Many people on the 3X in Belgium had 120 point delta on non-3X or non-Limitless teams. And then we've got Limitless in Hungary, where it could be an 80 to 100 point delta there as well. So think about that if you haven't used the Limitless on your team 2 or 3 and are in that McLaren Mini League on the F1 website. In terms of my asset tier ranking, again, talked about a lot of these drivers. This is not necessarily like for the budget builder on F1 Fantasy Tools, but more my perspective on drivers I think are well positioned for both points and a price rise this weekend. Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, no further comments, no further questions. Goes without saying, as is the McLaren constructor. I think Ferrari still deserve to have the favoritism over Red Bull, but I really like the Red Bull constructor this weekend. They've had the fastest pit stop for the last 2 race weekends, and both Tsunoda and Verstappen finished in Q3 in Belgium for the first time since I think it was Miami or Imola, around that point. So they're building back into form. I don't think they're an immediate buy. I want to see a bit more from both of them, but it is an encouraging sign and perhaps a little bit more variation given that the 4A lineup seems a couple of races away at least. If you want a 1-week punt, I don't hate the idea of Red Bull this weekend. Hulkenberg, Stroll, Behrman, already perfectly fine. Albon, fine. Alonso, probably only there because of his qualifying record. A lot of people own him. Yes, he might go down in price, but he also is going to, I think, be in and around the points again this weekend. And then Lawson's my pick of the 4.5 millions. I think the B tier constructors, it's just not the weekend for them at the moment. Feel free, don't let me tell you otherwise. Play your own game in F1 Fantasy. But I don't think there is really much time and space for a B tier constructor where qualifying is imperative at this track. So I would steer clear of them. If you can get to Mercedes, if you're a lower budget F1 Fantasy team, I'd even go for a Mercedes and McLaren and Piastri over the likes of a Piastri, Russell, McLaren and Kick Sauber, for instance. So just something to think about. Again, wait until we see the sims in free practice, but that's my gut feeling a couple days out from the deadline. In terms of my final team thoughts, again, I've talked about Piastri long enough. I sound like a broken record. He's an exceptionally good value for money F1 fantasy asset for the 2X, but again, Norris, Verstappen for their qualifying records at this track. Lando Norris in particular, probably not enough is said about him, and we'll go quickly over to another favorite resource of mine, the Big Data F1 website, which I've got up on screen here. Punch that into your search bar on Google or wherever, and you'll be able to find statistics on every Formula One driver ever. So I've searched Lando Norris, as you can see here, just as this search bar has come up, it'll show you all of his results over the years. If we dive straight into track performance, and you can do this for every driver, every team, every year in Formula One. You get the podiums, the poles, the wins of the driver in question. And look at Lando Norris. In terms of, I think, an alternative, Max Verstappen, we could talk about him at the Hungaroring. Lando has outperformed his teammate every visit he's had to the Hungaroring. So I think a good omen for him. You also go down to the circuit filter further down here. Let's just type it in because I haven't got all night to search for the Hungaroring. You can see Lando has qualified in the top 4 each of the last 3 years, has consecutive P2s, and I think he'll be looking to go one better this time around. And I think that's just a very good omen for a driver in what is now the fastest car on the grid. So pole position last year, I fully expect he's going to be in the box seat for a pole position this year. Yes, Oscar won at the Hungarian Grand Prix last year, but that was all around the swapping of the drivers during that race. So I don't think anything quite like that's going to happen again this time around. Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, definitely 2 of my favorite picks for the 2X option this week. In terms of Limitless, as I said, probably a Team 2 or Team 3 for those mini league teams, or if you haven't used it yet on your Team 1, but I use mine in Monaco, so not for me this weekend. There is discussion and discourse around the chance of rain in Hungary, 70% chance at the time of recording, so keep an eye on the forecast. It could increase, it could decrease, but we just know how much chaos the rain has inflicted in recent race weekends in Silverstone and Belgium, so there could be more of that this time around in Budapest. And with no sprint race on the agenda, it's straight back to normal programming as per usual. So the deadline is qualifying. I have every expectation I will be doing a deadline stream leading into the summer break because I've been pretty slack with those lately. But that is normal, regularly scheduled program for F1 Fantasy and the Team Lock deadline. So back to my F1 Fantasy team. You've probably seen all of the ideas I tossed out in my team selection video, but let's revisit it one more time. Option number 1 for me this week is a 1-for-1 swap for Alonso out and Liam Lawson in. I just think it's a nice way to set up for needing cheap assets in my team when I get in a second premium driver and another premium constructor a few weeks down the track. So I think Lawson becomes a nice hold as soon as his DNF in Silverstone falls off his average. I could also from here move from Oliver Behrman into Alexander Albon. And I think that decision for me is going to be largely dependent on what we see from Albon in free practice on Friday and Saturday. If the Williams just isn't with it, I just don't think I'd go there. But if he is looking like a top 5, top 6 driver, then I have every expectation I could see him in my team come the deadline. I just love Albon as a driver. He's very consistent. He's a fun driver to watch and root for. So for me, that's my second alternative for this weekend. There isn't really much else for me to consider. Now, I did talk about the Red Bull constructor and potentially what I could do there. If I went down that path, that would mean keeping Oliver Behrman most likely, and maybe even upgrading Fernando Alonso. Can I get to Albon? No, I'm a 1.5 short. That just doesn't even mean I can do anything. I think I'm kind of backed into a corner with my budget. But again, kind of going back to that budget preservation, the alternative though with Red Bull is not going down the Lawson route and instead having enough money. I'm just short for Lando Norris, but having enough money to bring in Max Verstappen if I'm really convinced it's Red Bull's weekend. But I just don't know if it is quite the right time yet. Again, would have to be pretty convinced by Red Bull over Friday and Saturday to go down that path. And look, the Lando Norris option is certainly in consideration. That would just mean, however, if I went down that route instead of Piastri, I need to find space. And for me, it's probably Lance Stroll again or Oliver Behrman. If I kept Stroll in just because I think, is it Stroll if we go over to the budget builder? Who needs the 1 point? Just Stroll needs 2 points for the max rise. So I'm more inclined at this point to keep Stroll, even though he is a dreadful qualifier. If we put him back in the team, what does that look like? 5.8. Probably Bortoletto for me. Not I'd happily eat a $0.2 million loss. Or Colapinto. I'm not sure. Colapinto is dreadful as well. So you're kind of left with the best of a bad bunch. But these two moves are going to be largely based on whether or not I think Lando is streets ahead of Oscar Piastri. But that's pretty much the three teams or three combinations I'm looking at with Albon, with Lando Norris, and with Red Bull as kind of those deviations from the norm. But otherwise, feeling very likely I do go down or keep the Oscar Piastri slot occupied by him, keep Behrman, roll a transfer. But I've said this so many times before where it's going to be a boring week and we get to the deadline and we're going in circles as to what the right decision is. But I'm going to leave that there for now, guys. A very quick final thoughts, but wanted to just get this down. I say on paper, but really on the screen. As I said earlier, I will be back with the deadline stream this weekend, so please drop by. It's the last one before the summer break, so it would be great to see all of that engagement in the live chat as per. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave that with you for now. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all very soon.